Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sama, and I'm the Programs Manager at the Gardiner Museum. Welcome to our annual Anne Walker Bell Lecture. You may have noticed that your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. There will be a Q&A following today's lecture, and so we invite you to send us your questions through the Q&A function at any point. And please note that this lecture is being recorded for internal archives and may be available at a later date on our YouTube channel. Although we are joined here virtually, I would like to acknowledge that the Gardiner Museum operates on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. Thank you again for being here with us. I would now like to welcome our Senior Curator, Kenny Zumis, to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thank you, Sama, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with you today for our annual lecture on Chinese ceramics, which is supported by the Bell family. About 20 years ago, Robert Murray Bell and Anne Walker Bell donated a significant collection of Chinese blue and white wares, which really set the foundation for our collection of Asian ceramics at the Gardiner Museum. It's now a pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Anke Hein. Dr. Hein is Peter Moore's Associate Professor in Chinese Archaeology at the University of Oxford. Her main research interests lie with intercultural contact and human-environment interaction, especially as reflected through ceramic technology. She received her PhD from UCLA in 2018 and has served as postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University and at the University of Munich the following years, and then joined the faculty of the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford. She is the principal investigator of a long-term research project on ceramic production and usage in Bronze Age Northwest China, and also conducts ethnoarchaeological research on ceramic production in Shanxi and Gansu. She is also co-principal investigator for a field research project on human response to high-altitude environmental change on the eastern rim of the Tibetan Plateau, conducted in collaboration with UC San Diego, the Sichuan Provincial Institute of Archaeology, Sichuan University, and Beijing University. Today, she will present a lecture entitled Painted Pottery in Northwest China, a meeting of past, present, and future. Please please join me in welcoming Dr. Anke Hein. So now over to you.
Thank you very much for your kind introductions, Karine, and a big thanks to Sama Kogabi for organizing all this, and great thanks to the Gardiner Museum and the entire team from the Gardiner Museum for making this possible, including the recording. So thanks to the IT team for this. I will now start sharing my screen. No, not this one. So I hope you can now see my presentation. Yeah. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about painted pottery in Northwest China, a meeting of past, present, and future. So we're going to start out not as in the deep past, but in the 1920s. So Northwest China was one of the first places, if not the first place, in China where modern scientific archaeological excavations were conducted. These were actually conducted on the back of or in connection with geological work that was done by a Swedish geologist, Johan Gunnar Andersson, and his Chinese colleagues. He had been invited to China to help establish a Chinese geological survey modeled after the Swedish geological survey to just understand the landscape in China and to find raw material sources and to train geologists who would be able to continue that work. He did that for a couple of years and then said, like, my work is done, my colleagues here are amazing. But what he continued doing was archaeology. He became super interested in archaeology because his approach to geology and to research more generally was one looking at humans as part of the environment. He was interested in seeing how the entire environment changed over time, what animals used to live there, what the surface cover was. You have to remember that in the 1920s, we didn't actually know much about that, at least not for large parts of Asia. So he then became more and more interested in the remains that humans had left to understand how humans affect the environment and are affected by it in return. So quite modern questions, actually. So what happened was he went around and started collecting pottery in particular, and he found some really, really amazing painted pottery sherds and showed them to colleagues. So he found them in northwest China at Yangshao, the site is called. And that is maybe, if you're not entirely familiar with Chinese archaeology, the nearest site that you possibly know is Xi'an, where the Terracotta Army was found. So that's not too far away. And he showed that to European colleagues who were like, well, that looks a bit like stuff we have more in Central Asia and even further west. So maybe that came from over there. It's possibly of foreign origin, like painted pottery, might not be local. And Anderson was like, okay, that's a hypothesis. Let's test this. So from Yangshao, which is a little bit further east, he went to Gansu and Qinghai and started looking around and found a huge number of sites that were actually later and where the pottery had clearly developed from the pottery that he found at Yangshao. So it was very clear the painted pottery came from the east, which was really important on many levels. For one, because at the time there was this attitude of like, well, all major cultural developments have to come from the West, right? And that was clearly proved that very, very early on already, there was incredibly sophisticated pottery production happening in China that actually had influences going further west, maybe not all the way to Europe, but like towards Central Asia and so on. And that was by no means external. It was also the first time that any early archaeological cultures were defined in China, and it was an amazing collaboration between Anderson, who was Swedish but employed by the Chinese government. So he didn't do this as a Swedish citizen or somebody who worked in a colonial way, but he worked for the Chinese government in this instance. And he worked with Chinese colleagues whom he acknowledged in his writings. One of the most fun people he worked with was somebody who had been hired to be his cook. Turned out he was a terrible cook, but he was really, really good at drawing maps and became a very good archaeologist. So he was one of the main people who keeps on being mentioned. And I'm trying to find out more about him because a lot of later literature just talks about Anderson, not about the people he worked with. Anyway, based on his finds, Anderson concluded that painted pottery of northern China was a local phenomenon. Nevertheless, the damage had been done because initially the Western scholars had said like, this is of Western origin. Then come to the 1970s, some scholars took that as a kind of base for fighting against Western imperialism and against colonialists and so on. For instance, Anke saying some reactionary bourgeois scholars shifted the chronology of the Yangshao culture, vainly attempting to find new grounds for the reactionary theory of the Western origin of Chinese culture. Another Chinese scholar, Tong and Zheng, responded to that saying, no scholar holds that all Chinese culture or civilization came from another place. Using an imaginary enemy to spur the political militancy of Chinese archaeology, in fact, deceives Chinese archaeologists. So this example shows us very clearly that archaeology is, even though it looks into the deep past, is very much about the present and to a certain extent the future as well, because it speaks very much to identity. It can be used by nationalism, by colonialism, and so on and so forth. And it reflects very strongly how people perceive that the world works and should work, and the relationship between the place they come from and other areas. So it's actually a very political field of study. You wouldn't think so, because it's the ancient past, but it is highly political. So what happened to the Anderson finds in the meantime? Well, he excavated and purchased material from like over 50 sites in northwest China. Amazing sites, amazing material. All of this material was first taken to Sweden to be catalogued. And then, per agreement, half of it was sent back to China, and half of it stayed in Sweden to become the founding collection of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, or called in Swedish as Asiatiska Museet, or in Chinese Yuandong Boguan. And so this was actually something that the two governments had agreed on. This was not stolen goods or anything like that. They were supposed to be in Sweden to show people in Sweden and in Europe what early Chinese material culture looks like. So the problem was a little bit, the timing was really bad when they sent back half of the finds. They kind of had a war going on, a second Sino-Japanese war. So most of these boxes just vanished. And some of them have now potentially been found again. So we're working on this. Some appeared in Nanjing, and we're trying to figure out if that is the right boxes. So we're working with colleagues in Sweden and in China to figure out if they may have found at least some of the collections. The collections in Sweden, unfortunately, were only preliminarily published, only parts of it. And yes, some are on display, like the complete vessels and so on, but there's a huge amount of archaeological material that hasn't been properly researched beyond the excavation stage of things, partially because of a lack of knowledge of Chinese well, there was a good Chinese, a good sinology Chinese studies in Sweden, like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but since then it's dropped off dramatically. Lack of funding, focus on other areas of the world, and so on. Lack of knowledge of Swedish among China scholars. That's not really the language you learn when you do Chinese studies, right? Unless you are Swedish. And so there's been a lack of research. And these collections are incredibly interesting, both because it's the largest collection from the largest number of sites from Northwest China anywhere outside of China. It is from material from many sites that are by now destroyed or inaccessible. And it gives a really good overview of early material culture from Neolithic and Bronze Age from that region. And it's very rich. They collected ceramics, they collected metal, they collected animal bones, they did soil samples, which is incredibly modern. This scientific excavation where you take soil samples and bones and everything and record everything in great detail is not something that was very common in the 1920s. So it's a very rich kind of material that has been dormant for a long time, and on which I've started working with colleagues from Sweden, China, and the US a couple of years ago. Now, why should we even care about Northwest China? I hope you can see this. That's like Northwest China. Great. Why is this important? Well, it's the beginnings of, or one endpoint of, what later is called the Silk Road. Of course, there wasn't a Silk Road there in the Neolithic or Bronze Age, but we're talking about something like a proto-Silk Road in the sense that it wasn't like very systematic long-distance trade. However, there was long-distance interaction, exchanging such things as early domesticates, which includes millet from China. So millet was first domesticated in northeast China and then went all the way to the west. Another place of domestication was Africa. So there's two different places. Then sheep and goat domestication happened outside of China, and these domesticates came into northwest China and then further to central China. We also have, of course, China internal connections, jade production in particular. So where we have in eastern China, like jade being incredibly important ritually, and then in similar forms also ending up all the way on the Tibetan Plateau. We have metallurgy potentially coming in from the west, and then going across the steppe in its very own tradition. While then in the Central Plains, we see a very, very different metalworking tradition, where instead of like knives and little ornaments and things like that, they suddenly made these huge bronze vessels in a very different technique, but also using the knowledge that you can melt down metal and make it into things. And then these kinds of this kind of technological knowledge and shapes also end up all the way in Southeast Asia. And new forms that were developed on the Central Plains then go all the way back towards Central Asia, and certain ceramic forms also end up in like the influence from the Central Plains ends up further west. Now, so we discussed these interactions. One problem with them, though, is that a major point of intersection is Northwest China, but we know relatively little what happened there on the ground, how this interaction worked beyond these like long distance interaction. We say like something in the very west looks like something in the very east and vice versa. But what did everyday people who lived there at this intersection point actually do? How did they live, and how did they deal with all of these things coming through, and how did they facilitate or not facilitate the exchange of knowledge and of goods? That is why that region is interesting. Well, that region is also rather complicated. Since Anderson was there, well, Anderson established a first chronology. He made a bit of a mistake in terms of like he first thought that the Xixia material here was earlier because it was less decorated. At the time, people were thinking like, oh, early stuff is more crude and later stuff is prettier, which in this case is actually not true, because the early painted pottery is super sophisticated and it becomes cruder the further you go to the Bronze Age, probably because people in the Bronze Age focused on bronze, on metalworking, and put less effort into ceramic production. This changed later, but at that time, this was how it worked. With a Chinese scholar called Xianai corrected that mistake already in the 1940s. And since then, we've had a pretty good chronology where we have the Neolithic, Mateyao, Banshan, and Machang, nice painted pottery. Then we get into the early Bronze Age where we have the first metals coming, which is Xixia, and there you have these handled jars. Then you have the much cruder but also still painted Bronze Age ceramics, and then all the way to Shajing, and then we get into the Iron Age. So the thing is, though, the scale at which this is happening and how far the same kind of materials, so-called archaeological cultures, are appearing varies vastly. You see in this map, it's really, really messy. So we have some of these types of ceramics, on like most of these archaeological cultures are defined based on shared ceramic types, the same ceramics appear over large areas, and others are like really tiny. So this one appears only here, or like Shama is only here. So this is really, really complicated. What is happening locally? Who actually makes which pots and why, and what do they do with those pots? So the main focus here has been on ceramic technology, on ceramic typology, so on the shapes, and only looking at making kind of these arrows on maps and saying like, okay, this is first appearing here, and then it moves over there, and so on and so forth. Now, this has especially then led to the discovery, or like the bolstering of the story that Anderson first came up with, namely that the first painted pottery we have is the Yangshao painted pottery in this region, and then later we get the Mateyao material, like the Mateyao painted pottery tradition, which is further west and is based on possibly people moving with their knowledge towards the west for unknown reasons. So if we want to learn more about how this all worked, obviously we have to look both at the area where we have Yangshao and the area where we have Mateyao material. Now, for the Yangshao material, we recently, by now probably recently, this is dating me slightly, like 15, by now potentially 20 years ago, they discovered a site called Yangguanzhai, which is in north of Xi'an. Xi'an is where the terracotta warriors are. And that site is very, very interesting. It is a two-phase site. It's a very, very big site with a ditch around it. And it has two phases like Miaodigo and Banpo. You don't have to remember these names, but it has been used for quite a long time and then suddenly abandoned, possibly due to flooding. We're not entirely sure. And there was a lot of ceramic production here. We have a lot more wastes, so broken ceramics that didn't fire well, that didn't work out, across the site than could possibly be needed by a single settlement. Additionally, we have a lot of kilns. These are ceramic kilns, so updraft kilns. Down here you would put in the fuel, and up here would be the ceramics. The point of this is that only the heat goes up, but not the smoke, so the pottery doesn't get blackened from the fire. And you have a lot of these, and they're kind of lined up like kiln, workshop, kiln, workshop. They're like beads on a chain, very pretty. And there's a lot of them. So it has been suggested, well, maybe this area was just a production center and things were like traded out from the center. We don't know yet. We have to learn more about technology to understand this. We can't just do this based on types. Why? Because like outer shape and decoration, you can copy just by seeing it. You don't, if you're a potter, you don't necessarily need to talk to another potter and learn from them, maybe be the student of somebody who is in this tradition to be able to imitate a pot that looks roughly the same way, like pottery from a different tradition, such as Yangshao. However, if you learned directly from a Yangshao potter, then you would have the same steps of making the material, like making the pots, like the same way of choosing raw material, the same principles of choosing raw material, the same way of processing it, the same way of shaping it. And this is what we're currently working on. We don't have an answer. I'll tell you a lot of things, but we don't have an answer yet, but which are very interesting questions that we're working on. Why are we interested in how was it made? Well, as I said, it will tell us if it was a direct teaching, if it maybe potters moved and then made Yangshao style pottery further west, or if they taught potters further west how to make it, or if it was just a matter of the vessels being traded and then local potters being like, I'm gonna imitate that, but I'm using my techniques. So we're still working on this. We're also working on figuring out if raw materials were traded, or if it was all local raw materials. To understand that, we've been talking to local potters. This is a bit difficult in the area around Xi'an, quite simply because it's urbanized, it's industrialized. So there's very few people who still make pots there, quite simply because they can't compete with Taobao, which is an online selling platform where you can buy everything and anything just online, and it appears on your doorstep within a day, even if you're in the middle of nowhere. It's a very amazing place to buy whatever you want if you are in China. And they can't compete with the prices, the local potters. Some still do it. So we're really lucky to find some old potters who are like, well, my children are not going to do that, but I'm 60 and I'm going to change my profession right now. I'm still making these. And so we talked to them. We've looked at where they built their kilns, which will help us to understand where would you make a center of ceramic production or ceramic production at all? They said, you need to be by the water, you need to be by the raw material, and you need to think of fuel. You also have to think of fuel. This is very important. It's something we oftentimes forget, that you need a lot of fuel to fire ceramics, especially at a large scale, and that sometimes ceramic production centers are abandoned or no longer feasible because they've cut down all the trees around it, and it's becoming too expensive to transport the fuel there. So you start transporting potentially the raw material somewhere else. It's also very interesting. I really love this, just going to these places and talking to people who live in this landscape where people lived in the Neolithic, people who I research, to learn how they see the environment, how potters work in this environment, and what they consider important. Because in addition to these natural environments and raw materials, another thing they have to think of, they can't build their kiln in the middle of a town because of the fire hazard. Also, they're not being very popular if they put a fire hazard in the middle of the town, and additionally all that smoke that comes with firing the kilns and so on. But they need to be somewhere where there's water. So maybe they might be at the edge of the village, where there's a well, or close to a river. But they also have to consider where's their market. They can't like make pots in the middle of nowhere with no way of getting them to their customers. So just talking to present-day potters has been incredibly illuminating to understand how people in the past may have worked when making pottery, how they decided where to go, We also talked to a few potters who had actually who came from potting families from entirely different areas, who had come to the area of Xi'an like in the 20s or in the 50s because of famines, or maybe even in the 1800s because of famines. That's always the big story. Like, well, there was a famine, we had to leave. And as potters, they just went and did a survey, like nearly like a geological survey, and went around and looked where was their clay they could work with, where was their market they could work with, where was their water, where was their fuel. So it's really, really interesting to hear those stories, to envision how in the past and understand how in the past potters may have, and why and how they may have moved from one place to another, bringing their knowledge with them, bringing their traditions with them, and either establishing like just a new business there and then monetizing it, or like teaching locals how to make it, potentially, depending on if they came with a big family already, or if they needed workers to work for them and with them because they were just one individual who needed to establish a new workshop and therefore had to hire locals. We also found it very interesting to talk to local potters to look at some of the tools they were using, because we really have trouble, archaeologically speaking, to identify tools that were used in pottery production. Why is that? Well, clay is soft. It doesn't actually leave any traces on any tools you're using. So there's no use where you can analyze and say like, here's a cut and there's a cut. No, because the clay is soft, this will not happen. Additionally, we learned from the local potters, well, a lot of their tools are expedient, meaning that they're using whatever's lying around and kind of seems to work. Like, for instance, for polishing, one of the potters was like, I just used this bit of rubber that was lying around. It polishes fine. I found this stone that has a very smooth surface. It polishes fine. So there's all of these things that seem to be really random. And we also find some of these archaeologically. So if you then look at archaeological material, either with your potter of trust next to you, or with the eyes of a potter by having pottery training yourself, you will suddenly be able to identify potential tools for pottery production that before you were just like, I have no clue what this is. So very, very helpful and very important to talk to locals. Now, moving from the Yangshao area, the earliest painted pottery, to Majiayao, where we have the later and tradition of painted pottery, where the vessels are much bigger, much more complex designs, but very homogeneous over a very large area. There is the Tao River Valley project. So a lot of the research that has been done in the last, when did it start? Maybe 10 years ago. It's currently a bit on a hiatus. Because COVID came in between and all of these things. And it is a collaborative project between Harvard with Ron Flatt in the lead, Furman University with Andrew Womack, the Gansu Provincial Institute of Archaeology, Peking University, and a couple of other universities have also been part of the team, where the project has been revisiting sites that Anderson and others have discovered to see if we could find traces of pottery production and metal production, to just see where actual production places, not necessarily centers. And we found a lot of really, really interesting features. In connection with that, my wonderful colleague, Hong Ling Yu, who sadly passed away of cancer just at the age of not even 40, I think, she had done really very interesting research doing chemical analysis on ceramics, on painted pottery, to see if painted pottery was traded. The idea being that you can fingerprint raw material to specific geological sources. The idea was great. She looked at a lot of material from the Northwest and also the Southwest to see how far material may have been traded. The research was criticized, though, because people felt like, well, if you have a very complex kind of material and you just grind it up you wouldn't be able to tell if it is just pure clay the way it came from off the mountain. But potters don't necessarily use the pure clay. They may take out some of the rocks. They may add other material, a so-called temper, to make it easier to shape, or for it to work better as cooking vessels, or so on and so forth. So what do you actually measure if you just do a pinpoint kind of chemical analysis? Now, to work around that, both in connection with the Tahoe River Valley project and what we call the Excavating Andersen project, where we're like going into the museum in Stockholm to do research on the material that Andersen excavated in the 1920s and that nobody has touched since the 1940s, we decided to do petrographic analysis on ceramics. So what is petrographic? Well, first of all, we wanted to do petrographic analysis, meaning that you cut thin sections, little slides out of ceramics, and you analyze them macroscopically to understand their composition, which allows you much more clearly to understand what of the material in there was added by humans, which is naturally present, and from where it might have come. Now, the museum didn't like the cutting something part particularly, which is very understandable. Of course, we didn't want to do that with whole vessels, but with shirts, still, they said, like, well, can't you do more like of the XRF analysis, the chemical analysis, where you just have a machine that you just point at the shirt and you do a reading? And we said, like, well, we don't think it works particularly well, but we'll do it. And so we did. And what ended up happening? Very non-descriptive clouds. We're like, see, we told you. The only thing that we could really say was that there was a major difference in calcium content. What does that mean? Well, if you have a lot of calcium in it, the color of a fired ceramic will be more yellow. If you have less calcium in it and more, therefore more iron, it will be more red. Plus the behavior during firing, if you have more calcite, depending on how big it is, there's a greater danger of vessel failure. So there's very clear, like a potter will know from the material and how it behaves if it's like high or low in calcite, and will know what they actually prefer. Do they pay a lot of attention to the color? Do they want it yellow? Do they want it red? And do they want, and how do they deal with the danger of vessel failure in firing with or after firing with higher calcite levels. This has to do with the expansion of calcite being different from that of the surrounding clay. If you have larger calcite pieces, plus calcite likes water. So once you fire the pot and it seems it has worked, and then you put it into the air, you put it somewhere for cooling, and bam, it explodes. Why is that? Because the calcite in there has been like, ooh, nice. There is water in the air, I'll attract that, which means they expand and the whole thing explodes. So that's why, like, when we do just the chemical analysis, this is the only thing we can really say: high calcite, low calcite, and that is significant. We cannot fingerprint or pinpoint exactly where the material came from. Why is that? Well, because in Northwest China, we're sitting on a loess plateau. What is loess? Loess is wind-blown material that comes from the Gobi Desert, in this case. We also have loess plateaus in Europe, for instance, when it comes from somewhere else, for instance, from the Sahara and so on. We do have, in other parts of the world, they come from other deserts. Here, the loess plateau in Northwest China, the material comes from the Gobi Desert largely. Because it is wind-blown material, the way it works is like wind blows and picks up material. The heaviest material falls down first, the lighter material is carried on further, the lightest material all the way to the ocean potentially. But that means that over large areas, the material that you have that is deposited and then it goes through its sedimentation process and ends up being clay, is very, very similar over large areas. So the chemical composition might be the same between a site like in Gansu and one like 300 kilometers further east. That is slightly annoying because you can't actually fingerprint and pinpoint exact location. Now, how do we deal with that? Well, for one, we try not to expect to do the exact dislocation kind of thing. But as I said, like when the wind blows, the heaviest material falls first. While the chemical signature may be the same across, more or less, you can, if you look at thin sections, you can see, is the material coarser or is it less coarse? And you can use that to a certain extent. The further away from the source you go, the finer it should be. Obviously, there's also other processes that we can make use of for identifying at least from which river valley it came, because through the loess, the rivers will cut through it and will bring material with them. So you have a combination of the wind-blown material plus river-brought material, and then at least you can say something about which river valley we might be in, depending on which geological formations it went through, and therefore which kind of rocks and other things, minerals and so on, it brought with it. Still, the traditional, like, let's do chemical analysis approach that works incredibly great in the Mediterranean, where you have very, very distinct geochemical signatures even in different parts of Sicily, because of the volcanic activities that lead to very unique local signatures. So we can't just transpose these methods to the Northwest Chinese Loess Plateau. So what we do instead here is we make a cut through the ceramics, and then we look at the little inclusions it has and try to figure out how they are shaped, what of this composition is natural, what humans may have added or subtracted, how high the firing temperature was, and so on. These are all things that you can find out to a certain extent using so-called petrographic analysis by putting it under a microscope like that. I won't bore you with technical details, but it has something to do with how light breaks when it hits minerals and their different surfaces, and then you get nice colors. It also looks very pretty, and it tells you something about the minerals and then the rocks, and therefore the kind of geological deposits that have formed this material. My colleague Andrew Womack did some of this research on newly excavated material from Mateau, so Neolithic in northwest China, after Yangshao, Mateau material, and Xidia, the early Bronze Age material, and found that actually in terms of material composition and the way that people treated the material, technologically speaking, the ceramics from these two phases were largely identical, even though visually they looked very different. The Mateau material is beautiful, large painted pottery, high-fired, beautifully done. The Xidia material is largely small little vases. They're nice, they're very thin-walled, but they're mostly not painted. They're small, they're not that big. And so they look visually very different. And typologically, everybody was like, this is a huge break. It's totally different. Yes, it's also made, the same pottery is made over a large area, but it's a complete break from the Mateau tradition and must have been different people. Really? Well, technologically, it's the same. So there's still the same potters from the same traditions making Xidia pots rather than Mateau pots. Andrew Womack has mostly, exclusively worked with material from one river valley, which has its limitations, obviously, because what he observes may just be a very small local particularity and may not apply to these broader areas over which we see Mateau and Xidia material. Therefore, Ole Stilborg, my colleague Ole Stilborg, and I went in to the ceramic at the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities that Anderson had picked up from like 50 sites across this vast area, and picked out material that visually, from the outside, looked as if it was the same. So we looked at the Mateau, the Neolithic material, and looked at stuff where everybody said like, oh, this is Mateau fineware. And then we looked at Mateau coarseware. Turns out fineware can look like this with like hardly any inclusions, or like this with a lot of sand in it. And outside, visually, it's the same, but it's clearly different raw material, which would have behaved differently when shaping it. The same for coarseware. We have some that is naturally sandy clay, other material where sand was added, other material where crushed rock was added. So vessels that look very different from the outside, look the same from the outside, can be very different in terms of how they were made, in terms of choice of raw materials. And there's a lot more variation between different sites than what the studies from the Tau River Valley would have us believe. Furthermore, we have found that for the Xidia period, there's something new appearing. Yes, there's continuity from the Neolithic Mateau to the early Bronze Age Xidia, But we also have something really interesting appearing, namely crushed ceramics used as tamper, used as added material to the ceramics to improve its workability. So this is something that wasn't discovered before. And when looking into the later Bronze Age materials, which nobody does because they think it's ugly, because the material is coarse. Well, for one, we found the material is indeed very coarse. And technologically speaking, it's a bit puzzling. Excuse me. It's very coarse with a lot of material added in. And keep in mind, this is still in the same area. They had the same raw material available. They could have had this wonderful, nice quaternary red beds that are also aeolian, so also wind blown, and are very fine already. But they decided to use very coarse material and then add even more coarse material to it, which would have made it much harder to work. Why did they do that? Well, I'm still waiting for answers there, but it is something that is happening. Now, what we did quite recently, the paper just came out earlier this year, was we looked at sites from like Neolithic, early Bronze Age, and late Bronze Age from different parts of Northwest China, so this area, like Gansu and Qinghai, to see what the differences are. So this is the Taoru River Valley that has been very well researched. What has not been researched are these other valleys. So we compared them and had a not so nice kind of surprise that some of the sites that are type sites for a specific archaeological culture actually mostly have material from later periods or earlier periods. So it's all a bit slightly messy. So we did find, though, that when we look at sites from outside the Taoru River Valley, where most of the previous research has been done, there's a lot more variation in the raw materials used and in the technology, and so in a way, raw materials were chosen and processed at sites, making vessels that otherwise looked largely identical. For the Bronze Age, it becomes incredibly complicated, and every site seems to have its own recipes. There's a certain amount of overlap, especially in the use of grog, which I will show you here. So grog is crushed ceramics, and there we see a very interesting phenomenon happening. This is something that seems to start very far northwest, so more in Qinghai and in Gansu, to add crushed old ceramics to clay to make pots. And they're using not just their own ceramics that they're making anyway, but they seem to be using earlier wares, like fine wares, which they're not producing themselves. So are they going around and using Neolithic pottery to make their own Bronze Age pottery like 1,000 years later? It seems like that is what is happening. We need to do further analysis using higher magnification. So this is all done on a normal petrographic microscope, where we can magnify up to 40 times, which isn't really enough for something. So I have to put it under the scanning electron microscope, and that will be the next step to learn more about the grog particles and what kind of material, what kind of vessels they belong to in the past. We also have something that my colleague very fittingly called punkware, where like all kinds of stuff is thrown in. Another colleague called it everything but the kitchen sink. So everything is in there, and it seems like completely illogical as to why so many different types of materials would have been thrown into the clay, which makes it much harder to work. And then they have to put a paint layer or slip layer on it to even be able to use this vessel in any way, shape, or form, rather than just using the pure clay and having a really, really nice vessel body without a lot of work. Why would they have done that? I think it has a lot to do with meaning. So crushing another vessel and putting it into a new vessel obviously brings something from that old vessel into the new vessel. If you put a lot of other things like rocks and sand from different places, that must have a deeper meaning. So I think it is actually like very meaningful that they do that. They don't just randomly do that. They don't make their life harder for no reason whatsoever, but it has a very deep meaning. So overall, we found that material, so the Neolithic material, is rather homogeneous between and within sites in the Tower River Valley, both in styles and shape and technological details, but there's a lot more variation in technology further afield. There's, as my colleague Andrew Womack had found, continuity in material and titya through vessel shapes and decoration changes, but from titya more courseware appear, especially outside the river valley. So there, the picture is a bit different from what my colleague had originally thought. In the late titya, so that's Middle Bronze Age, we start seeing the grog tempering tradition, so the crushing of old pots, starting in the Qinghai region, so relatively far west towards Central Asia. And it then becomes really, really common in the Middle to Late Bronze Age throughout the area. Some of these Middle Bronze Age cultures, such as Kayo and Siwa, combine elements from other cultures. So it's, as well as their own particularities, there's a lot of regional particularities that are very difficult to leave apart. We're still working on that one. Overall, this doesn't just tell us something about pottery. We also know from just the overall archaeological material that there seem to be major disruptions in the societal order from the late Neolithic to Middle Bronze Age, with titya as a transition point, completely, like there's major changes in subsistence practices. The sites become much smaller, like the ways of burying people become very different. They start metal production and so on. So this is all reflected in the ceramic technology and vessel appearance, going from an orderly split between just fineware and coarseware to many different micro traditions that are very complicated and have a lot of local individuality, which is really interesting. None of this is sudden, though, but these are all gradual changes over time that we're trying to trace. Other things that we're working on is, well, if you look at, we want to understand how people choose raw material and where they choose it. And for that, we need to have a better understanding of the local geology. Just looking at the big geological maps is somewhat helpful, but they're really large scale. Plus, they're two-dimensionally depicting a three-dimensional kind of thing, where we have deep layers and people may have taken something from the middle layer that isn't even depicted on the map. So we started doing geological survey. So again, Andrew Womack did some of that work, as did my former student Evgenia Dama, and we worked together on a paper on that, just around one site as a start to collect raw material that could be used in ceramic production. Then Evgenia went through all the trouble of making little ceramic bricks and doing test firing at different temperatures to see how they behaved and which of these could actually have been fired into ceramics. And she found that the majority of them, even though technically you would think, because you find the material in the field and you know you can knead it, so you're like, I could shape this into something, but a lot of these just explode in firing because of their high calcite content. So even though technically there seems to be a lot of material that could have been used, in their raw shape, in their raw form, because she was firing them in their raw form, only very few are actually usable. This goes against what I had originally thought, that, well, you can just pick up some clay and just make a pot. No, many of these need addition of like so-called temper, like rocks or whatever, to give them stability so that they don't explode on you. Some of them may need to be levigated, so that certain parts of the material are washed out, and so on and so forth. We'll have to do further experimental work and geological surveys around other sites to see how the story works out over larger areas. We are also working again with local potters. So the good thing about the beautiful Neolithic material pottery is that you can make money with it by making replicas and like what they call 小工艺品, like small like collectible items for tourists, where everybody knows it's not the real thing, it's fake, it doesn't matter, but they're just being sold as for tourists. And it started like very close to the site of Mateo. There's a little village where there were potters who were just making like everyday pots. And then one day a person called Li Zhimin showed up, who couldn't make pots at all, but he was quite learned, and he was like, hey, why don't you make material pots, like these Neolithic things? People like to buy them. And so they started this collaboration, this family there, with this scholar, to make imitations of first material and later also like Bronze Age pots, to sell them to tourists, but also to make replicas for museums and so on. And it's quite interesting to see the difference in attitude towards how they're working with it. So the father, this guy, who started all of this, Jan Lauschel, his attitude is whatever works the easiest. So he happily uses a wheel, even though we know that the pots originally were not made with a wheel. He does expedite things by drying them in the sun, even though there's a high risk of it actually breaking in the sun. But he's like, it's just faster. He uses like rubber pipes for polishing, or sometimes also jade, but he thinks rubber pipes are just easier. And he just wants to have something that looks nice, but doesn't have to be 100% as it was in the past, because he's only selling them as for tourists. So it doesn't have to be 100% correct. His son is a bit more picky about it. He likes to be a bit more correct about things, but he also uses a wheel. That's how he was trained. Li Jiming, he himself, he says, I make pottery. I mean, I'm not even sure if he's still alive. He was very ill a couple of years ago. I haven't seen him in a long time. I'm trying to go back this July and see if he's still around. Actually, his wife makes all the pots. And and then he says, like, that's me making it. So he has done all the research and he looks up what they should be like. And he looks at archaeological publications to see what do archaeologists think these vessels were like and how should they be made. And then his wife makes these coil-made kind of pots, so they're not thrown on a wheel like we would do now modern pottery, but they're made with these little coils. And he also experiments with various types of colors. He was very, very cagey about where he got his coloring from. I think some of them were just bought, but he told us the story about like, oh, it's like I go up in the mountain and there's this secret place. I'm not too sure about that, but he also is trying to be as authentic as possible, potentially bridging into the forgery kind of realm, but that's of course a very difficult conversation to have. There's another family, the La family, Huizu Muslim family. They are amazing. So the grandfather apparently worked for Anderson and sold him some pots. They have worked with archaeologists to repair pots. So when you excavate pots and they're broken, to just put them back together and maybe put in like some new material to make it work all together so you can display them. They make also like replica. They're extremely good. They have the daughter-in-law has a master's in applied arts, and she does a lot of the decorations, and they've developed some new things like these things where they're using some later ceramic forms, like this is a maping shape, and decorations, especially the flower ornaments from their own Islamic tradition, together to make new things and come up with their own new ceramic traditions based on Neolithic decorations as well as other elements from different places. So I find this incredibly interesting because it shows how relevant the local history and archaeology is to people nowadays, and how they work with it, and how artisans pick up ideas and trends from various places and see what sticks. They make things that they think might work, that people might like. If they don't like it, they discontinue it, or they just make it for themselves because they still like it. So this is very interesting to observe, and I keep in touch with them to see how this tradition, this new tradition that is partially born out of Neolithic pottery with a big time gap in between, is developing. There's also young potters who work specifically with archaeologists to do experimental work, to try and find out how potters in the past really made their vessels, how they found the material, and so on. There's some that in connection with a conference a couple of years ago in Dadiwan, where showing us how they make pots, and with whom we worked. It was very, very nice. And then there's also just people who just happen to be potters living next to a site, such as Ko Yen Bin. His family just owns land right by a very important Yangshan site called Daliwan. And everybody agrees, him included, that his pottery isn't very good and that he's not very good at making pottery, but he owns that land and he will make pottery and sell it to the tourists who go to the site, and he will enhance them. I don't know if you can see that on the image. Some of these are just very shiny with like industrial colors and so on because he likes it better. And he's like, the tourists buy it, it's pretty, they're 小工艺品, they're just little collectible items. I'm not telling them this is Neolithic, it doesn't matter. If they like it, they'll buy it, and this is my land and I can do this. And everybody else around him agrees because, well, you make your own new tradition. Yes, you may borrow from the Neolithic, but this is still their area, that is still their land, and it is these old traditions to which they feel connected is something they can work with, and where they take a certain amount of ownership to make a living, but also to have their own cultural expressions that they're sharing with others. There's also others who are, such as Ma Chenglong, where it's a little bit more problematic, where there is questions of like forgery and so on. Ma Chenglong was not available for interview when I went because I was doing a stint at the police department, not as a policeman. And these are a little bit more problematic, and there is a bit of a crackdown because of trade and so on, and the mixing of like new objects and excavated objects, and not saying which is actually real and which is a forgery. But and there's also local potters who, well, locals such as Ma Yongzhong, who lives right by the Bronze Age sites Qitiaping, and who has decided that, well, people come and visit the site and there's nothing to see. That happens with archaeological sites. There's just nothing. This is a field. This was a big, important site. Aha. And people are disappointed. He's like, well, I'm now retired. I'm going to start to learn how to make pots. So he wasn't even a potter originally, but he just wanted to provide some pots to, well, to make some money, but also to not disappoint people who come to his home and are like, hey, we want to see some Bronze Age stuff. And he's like, well, start digging maybe. So he's now making these pots and selling them, and found his own way around the issue of like him not being trained as a potter originally. So he learned in his 60s to make pots, the Neolithic and Bronze Age way. So, and all of them have archaeological publications at home to understand how archaeologists understand pottery, while we look at them, at modern potters, to see how they understand Neolithic and Bronze Age pottery. It's all a giant circle, and it's a wonderful conversation between past, present, and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hein. It was really fascinating. You raised so many great questions about ceramic technologies and what they tell us about the past, and also the connections you drew between the past, the present. That was really fascinating to me. We can take some time to take a few questions. If you want to add your questions in the Q&A. We have one question that came in, which is, could you repeat the name of the Swedish the Swedish museum where the Anderson's collection is on view right now?
It's called the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, MFEA. The Swedish name is Östasiatiska museet. Mm-hmm. The Chinese name is Yuandong Boguan. They have a nice website that includes a fairly good catalog where you can see many of these objects. You can also see some of the work we've been doing. You can even Google my name, then all the stuff comes up that we've analyzed. So we've been working with them for a couple of years. Their director, Michael Lee, is a wonderful scholar and really nice guy. He happens to be a Chinese American from Texas, and very nice guy to work with. And some of the Swedish colleagues there are incredibly helpful. One of them, Mia Brunet, and many others who've been who can also be contacted with any questions. They're a bit overworked, so they may not always, like museums everywhere, they don't have enough people, but they're genuinely very, very helpful and happy when people ask them about their collections.
We have another question. So how do you differentiate between a forgery and a replica? And what is the attitude behind it? So how do people, I would imagine, like others in the field react, or perhaps that's governments also, I would imagine, are probably looking. You mentioned this one potter who was at the police station when you came. How are they dealing with these situations as well?
Well, so actually, one of the biggest concerns for archaeologists and I think also for law enforcement alike is not forgery, but grave robbery or like looting. So I'm not even that concerned about forgeries. I'm concerned that people make holes in the ground in a not scientific, undocumented way and get pots out there and then sell them on the market. And then they're just basically lost because we have no context. It's, of course, we can also work with material that are in collections to a certain extent, but there is severe limitations and it's a destruction. Without the context, these things become just mere pretty objects, and maybe not even that, because you never know what you're going to find, and they might not find them pretty and they'll just destroy them. Plus, the people who do the looting, they usually don't get a lot of money for it. The money is made elsewhere and big trading ports like Hong Kong or whatnot, where they're then rubber stamped or given a new pedigree and history and so on. So that's my biggest concern, really, in terms of and that is also what law enforcement and whatnot very much are behind. Obviously, forgery is a crime. The difference between forgery and replica is the intent. So I had a conference, a workshop, and an edited volume about understanding authenticity in Chinese cultural heritage. I'm very happy about the book. We got people together from art history, from archaeology, from anthropology, from history, from a lot of different backgrounds who work in China and on Chinese material, and think about like, what does authenticity mean? Is this even a value in it of itself? Should we be looking just for authentic stuff? What does authentic even mean? Does it have to be like one-to-one exactly like from like, does it have to be old? There's also other types of authenticity, for instance, trying to make something in the spirit of, doesn't make it a forgery. There's also a lot of other things about Chinese material culture somewhere else outside of Western European traditions, namely that there isn't necessarily a value in keeping things exactly as they are, but things may be recreated and changed and adapted to new needs. And there may not be so much of an emphasis on the physical, on it physically being the same as 1,000 years ago, but more that it still serves the same purpose or is done in the same spirit and so on. So these are like really complicated questions. When talking to the potters themselves, I found it interesting because the attitudes varied widely. Some seem to be like quite openly making forgeries and telling people, like just burying them somewhere in the ground and being like, so I found this in the backyard, not mentioning that they buried it there first. But they don't really say this is old. They just play dumb. They're like, I found this in my backyard. Now you draw the conclusions, right? You're the expert. You have to be able to identify if this is ancient or not. So it's a bit of a game. And I mean, they live on the countryside and they have to make a living. There's not a lot of money to be made, quite honestly. And they make money quite legally by making replicas and by making objects that are being sold to tourists, and that is entirely fine. There's no problem with that. I love how they make their own new traditions with it, how they mix different traditions, how they get inspired by the Neolithic pottery, how they make their own stuff, and especially this is something that is a more recent phenomenon, like the last 10 years or so, that they press their own seals onto these vessels and say like, I made this. I was inspired by a Neolithic tradition, or I made a pot that looks very Neolithic, but I made it. I'm proud to say this. I don't want to sell this to you as something that I've found somewhere that is ancient. I want to sell this to you as my accomplishment. Thank you. And that's something I find really interesting, how this develops among some of the younger potters. But it is, of course, also an economic question. And I don't feel right to judge, because people need to make a living. And yes, I'm not in any way condoning forgeries as such, but I'd rather have a forgery being sold to some collector who's unhappy rather than an actual site being looted and destroyed. But it is an ethical dilemma, absolutely.
Well, this is such a rich topic, and I wish we had another hour to talk some more with you. But this is all the time we have, and I want to thank you for your great presentation and for really introducing what I think probably to many is a new topic. So it is really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined our lecture today, and I wish you a really wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.